Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of the CCX update, and one of the interviews I love doing, and I feel especially grateful today because we've got Elaine Lee with us, who I had a brilliant conversation with the other week about working with vulnerable customers, and it just became immediately apparent we had to do an interview for you guys. So Elaine, thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome. It's nice to be here, James. To be able to share some thoughts with you.
Awesome. So yeah, Elaine is an experienced performance marketer with a particular passion for customer experience. And prior to co-founding Reynolds Busby Lee in 2005, Elaine worked as the global telemarketing director for IMP, managing a network of outsourced contact centers, handling inbound DRTV response, outbound calling campaigns, and customer services across the UK, Europe, Australia, and the USA. Elaine's been working in and with contact centres since 1995, and since 2005 she's been consulting for both charities and commercial companies to improve the customer experience and increase customer engagement, and an integral part of her work is around customers in vulnerable circumstances. She creates and delivers training for organisations to improve recognition of vulnerable customers and the application of reasonable adjustments to improve the CX, alongside developing marketing strategy and customer journey mapping. Elaine has also chaired the Telemarketing and Contact Centre Council and the Vulnerable Customer Task Force for the DMA UK, and is now considered a thought leader on customer vulnerability. She's also a board member of TPS Limited. So we're going to be talking today then on a theme of recognising vulnerability and advising others. And we're going to be going over the usual kind of 5-question format, and I think there's going to be some real nuggets throughout the whole conversation. So stay tuned for the whole thing. But we'll jump in. This interview is about helping those you're working with, agents or contact centres, to recognise and support vulnerable customers. As I said, we've spoken about the challenge of even acknowledging what vulnerable is. So can you tell us your view on what vulnerability means and the different forms it can take?
Yeah, sure. I think that it's a great starting point, and it's always where we start in our training, actually, is defining what vulnerability means. If you're thinking about a new topic, we often go look at the dictionary and see what that new word might mean. And vulnerability is quite a controversial label for many. People don't like to be labelled as being vulnerable because it typically indicates some sense of weakness or concern or inability to do something. The reality of being vulnerable is that you're in a position or a circumstance which makes your participation more challenging or difficult than most of us would expect, or the obvious design of our product or service. So we have to consider vulnerability in the sense of what am I vulnerable to, and what am I what support mechanisms or reasonable adjustments might I need to be able to participate as everyone else can within the marketplace. So I don't see it as being a weakness. It's about perhaps being in a position of a lack of market knowledge or product knowledge or understanding. So the first time you take out a mortgage or an insurance policy, for example, unless you are a broker, you are unlikely to know the ins and outs of how a particular mortgage might work, or then what an insurance policy covers. And those things are typically littered with legal terminology that the average person doesn't understand. So actually, many of us are vulnerable in that sense, and we often don't recognise that we are. The FCA run a financial lives survey pretty regularly, and it fluctuates somewhere between sort of 47 and 52% of the population show at least one characteristic of vulnerability at any one time. So it's, if there's two of us in the room, it's either you or me. And it actually, when you start to think about it in those terms, you think, actually, I'm not in the minority, I'm in the majority, or it's certainly a norm for us to not know everything about everything. And once you start to accept that, then I think vulnerability becomes more accessible in terms of understanding and how we might approach it, and it stops being pigeonholed into something that's too difficult or challenging. So the different forms it can take might be in terms of it being temporary. So it might be that somebody has a visual impairment, for example. Visual impairments, a temporary visual impairment might be having developed a cataract that is then going to be removed. and then that improves your vision and you're back to better vision. It might be progressive and you're at the early stages of a cataract and you have to wait for them to develop to a particular size before they can be removed. So that may be a progression of blurriness or a distortion in your vision. Or it might be that you have a permanent sight loss. And so there are different stages and different elements to vulnerability, and no two people are the same. So it's quite a complicated circumstance issue. But actually, when you sit down and remember that we're all people and we're talking about people and human beings and friends, families, neighbours, people we know in our social networks, people who we know through work, then it starts to have a human face to it, and actually we begin to tackle it more easily.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it, isn't it? It's all of us at one time or another. And I think the mortgage broking example is fantastic, because then you're really thinking about a group of people, reasonably young people, perhaps, who feel perhaps in the strongest position of their life. They've got their deposit together, they're ready to make a huge purchase. But actually, there is a lack of knowledge, awareness, and information. You need a good mortgage broker to guide you through that, and that is a vulnerability, because if you aligned yourself with someone that was only serving self-interest, you could be taken advantage of. And so actually that's a really great example of I guess what you would say is a temporary vulnerability. And then some people, we try and educate ourselves as time goes on, and we do learn a little bit more as we remortgage and so forth. But still, anytime you're seeking professional advice and guidance, you're opening yourself up, aren't you? So, as you say, it puts a real human face on it.
We like to talk about the mortgage example because actually it's one of the most stressful times in your life. There's all sorts of research that talks about buying a house, going through bereavement, getting married or divorced, or the big life moments. Those life moments come with stress. And actually, when you're looking for a property, whether that's to buy or to rent, it's about, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's about that basic level of having somewhere warm and safe to be at night and at home. And so our priority is about getting that basic need satisfied. However we do that, the rational part of our brain is being suppressed a little, and we're trying to deal with the basic need of I need somewhere to live and I need somewhere to sleep. And so our focus is about I will do whatever it takes to get that. And therefore, we sometimes don't necessarily listen well to advice that we don't understand. But it is really important that we try and keep ourselves calm and be able to do that. Because your priority is, perhaps I'm going to lose this house or the house of my dreams if I don't get a mortgage. Okay, I will accept this person's offering me a mortgage on those terms. I think I can afford it, but you're not really sure or clear on the terms. So sometimes we make decisions in a rush or in a panic because our emotional drivers are pushing us in one direction where a rational part of our brain would perhaps choose something else.
Yeah, exactly. Because we've seen over several years now, various financial institutions having to pay back amounts of money to customers where perhaps in those situations where they need loans or finance for things, and commission rates were not what they should have been, perhaps. People taking deals because they felt like they needed to, and really maybe taking advantage of the vulnerability of the psychology of that situation. And how do you handle supporting then the differences between, say, ongoing and temporary or transitory vulnerability?
So the work that we do with our clients, it's about, we start with trying to gain a level of understanding of what is that difference between an ongoing and a transitory vulnerability. So to give you an example, again, these things aren't always black and white. So somebody who has been bereaved, for example, may be going through a temporary vulnerability and transiting between states of loss and grief back into sort of a more normal state. But that doesn't have a fixed period of time. And it might be, depending on the relationship you have with the person you've lost, it might take you weeks, it might take you months, it might take you years, or you may never get over that loss if that's your your life partner, and it's they were your soulmate, so it can affect you for years and years. So trying to help people understand that each one of us is different and each one of us is human, and sometimes things will trigger us at moments, and then the same 3 weeks later that same comment might not trigger us because our emotional state's affecting. But it's about trying to, so the key to it for us is helping our contact centre agents, our people in branches who are working with customers in vulnerable circumstances, is to recognise what is happening at this moment, what is happening in the conversation between us now. Is that vulnerability, perhaps that bereavement, relevant to the conversation we're having? Is it affecting that person at this moment? Do I need to adjust at this moment the way I'm giving that information? Do I need to give them more time? Is it just the wrong time for us to have this conversation and I should reschedule it? Should I continue because actually this person seems to be coping quite well? Do I suggest a friend or family member comes in? And it's about thinking about the moment in time, and it changes every time you speak to a customer. So we have to be careful that we don't have centres with flags on databases that are there permanently and that they are reviewed and assessed. And those flags, or vulnerability flags, we often see on CRM systems or databases, are indicators that there might be something for consideration. But you have to have the skills and the soft skills to be able to deal with those conversations in the moment. And that's where the skill of being a customer facing agent or branch member comes into play. It's not an easy job, and often people are going through circumstances themselves that may affect their own emotional reactions. So it's about, we try and work with teams to recognise their own emotional reaction and the customer and try and support both, but don't blur the lines.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it makes perfect sense. And like you said earlier on, with those stats around the number of people that could be going through some level of vulnerability at any one time, if there's two people in a conversation, one is the contact center team member or agent and the other is a customer, the chances are that one of them is having something that to some degree in some aspect of their life is making them vulnerable. And I think therefore it's a real consideration, and that's why it's such a a fascinating topic. And what you were talking about there, I think, connects really nicely with something that occurred to me, and that's around customer personas. And so factoring in potential vulnerability must be absolutely critical. What are your thoughts on that, and could you explain why it might be?
Yeah, so lots of the work I do working with clients on customer experience, and that we might map a customer's journey, and we might map the process that you'll go through and the systems they interact with and all of those things. And lots of those things are often designed for the ideal customer. What's the normal state of events? The reality is humans don't all behave the same, and therefore we have different wants and needs. So we'll design different pathways through. But it's important to layer those customer personas with vulnerabilities. And I talk about layering because it's not always that somebody has one vulnerable circumstance, they may have multiple. And so it's worth layering some of those things through. So have a look at how a deaf person might navigate through your banking system for a telephone banking system, for example. Now, you may think a deaf person won't do that, but if they've got hearing aids in, they may be able to participate through that. But in your moment of a vulnerability moment, perhaps you've had your purse stolen and you're ringing to tell the bank that you've had your card stolen. Those are moments of stress, and your voice might not sound the same if you're deaf. Or, for example, a friend I know through LinkedIn, actually, Meryl, who talks to me about the steps she goes through, and she talks of her deaf voice. When she's not got a hearing aid in, her voice sounds very different. So she fails security, where my voice is my password, well, it doesn't sound the same, so the system doesn't recognise it. So she fails security. If you have a visual impairment, being able to navigate something online might be more challenging. You might not be able to see the boxes or work out what those capture things, the characters are, or hear the voice loudly if it's being read aloud to you. It might be that somebody with a mental health condition is struggling to navigate and concentrate. Somebody with ADHD, for example. I have a daughter with ADHD. It may be that her concentration breaks and she just can't follow the process because it's too long, it's too complicated. She gets distracted because there's too much going on in the screen elsewhere, and it's not focusing the task. you know, there's an advert popping up, or there's a pop-up, those blooming things that pop up all the time. Do you want to sign up to our newsletter? Not right now. I'm trying to tell you I've lost my bank card.
Yeah.
And so it's thinking about what's the journey that the customer wants to go through, as opposed to what's the journey we want the customer to go through, and then validating, does it work for people with visual impairments, mental health conditions, hearing loss? Because you will learn lots if you talk to people with lived experience, and it's one of the things I encourage our clients to do all the time, is access that lived experience. And that might be through your customer base, but it may also be something you can do for your staff, because
Absolutely.
we're all human, right? And as we keep coming back to in this conversation, there are two sides to every conversation. So, you know, is something clear enough on screen? Is it the right colour? Does it work for somebody with red-green colour blindness, for example, if everything's in, and we're talking and signposting to find the red thing and they can't see it? So it's just that sanity checking through lived experience. Does that work for me? And you'll find all sorts of things that make huge difference to people's ability to participate when you get it right and look at it through different lenses rather than just the lens of the ideal customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Funny, a friend of mine recently was trying to contact their bank. They had a fairly heavy cold and they failed the "my voice is my password" thing for exactly that reason, and that just then elevated their annoyance level going then into the call with the agent. And it was the inability to be able to sidestep that, or to say I'm unwell at the moment, and you know, it just changes the way my voice sounds. That they couldn't get around it, and they were frustrated going into that call. And then, of course, that changes then the stress levels of everything. And so it's fascinating when you start digging into the human elements of these things, the considerations, and the layering is such a good point as well, right? You know, there's just because you're going through one thing doesn't mean you can't be going through two or three, some of which are permanent, some of which might be progressive, etc., etc. So as a professional trainer and educator, then where do you see the challenges lying within organizations when it comes to change for, you know, handling and working with vulnerable customers?
So in our experience, the contact centre level team, so the agents, the team leaders, the contact centre manager, get this completely, and they want to drive change. They're totally on board. They're desperate for some training. They want some support. They want additional knowledge. Where we see difficulty is at more senior levels, for example, where he says, "Oh, but you've had vulnerability training. Why do you want more?" Well, things change all the time. There's new tech, there's new reasonable adjustments. Actually, we've discovered something else that we haven't thought of as being a vulnerability. Now we've identified it when we've been looking at our customer maps. We've identified that that is a moment where we are potentially creating vulnerabilities for our customers, and we want to isolate it. We want to eliminate it. And so it's because training is seen as a cost, and it's, you know, how do you demonstrate the value of being able to handle those customer complaints better, or those customer interactions? They shouldn't ever become complaints, because if you recognize somebody early enough, you make the adjustment early enough, and actually what you do is build loyalty and brand value and income if you get it right. But if you don't, then you're potentially looking at, you know, so we tend to come at it from different perspectives in terms of, are we building brand loyalty, brand value and income, or are we trying to save on cost, where we don't have so many complaints, we don't have such high turnover of staff, because our staff and contact centre teams feel well trained, well supported, and able to do the job that they want to do, and they're not struggling with processes that don't work. And so there's lots of different ways we have to look at it, sell the benefits of recognising vulnerability. And at the moment, and the latest report I've seen from the FCA says that 40% of vulnerable customers aren't recognised early enough in the process. So they will become complaints. They will become those angry people on the phone shouting because their voice wasn't recognised because they've got a heavy cold. And you know, what can we do proactively to stop those things happening? In my dream world of customer experience, that's what I want to deliver for clients. And so it's getting everybody trained to the right level on a regular and ongoing basis, and it's recognized as being a continuous need for development and learning of staff, because you can always learn. There's always something to be learned. And so getting that commitment of budget is probably the biggest challenge we see. And then it's about actually understanding how challenging and difficult a job being on the phone can be. So I always encourage senior level staff to come down and sit on the phones. If you can't face doing it on your own, come and sit side by side with somebody. But the more time you spend at the front line, at the coalface, hearing it, seeing it, the more you will understand the need to do it better.
Undercover boss. There we go.
Indeed.
That's why that program's been so successful for so many years. I'm a huge advocate of people with frontline customer-facing experience moving into other operational departments of businesses, taking that experience with them and being skilled up so that they can represent these sorts of experiences in the types of meetings that will be taking place that will affect those frontline contact center agents, team leaders, managers, perhaps unintentionally, but then they do have that trickle down effect, obviously, onto the customers. And I know as well from speaking to people at events and phone, all different things, the justification, the business case, the ROI for contact centers when it comes to change, when it comes to process change and training and things is really difficult. And it's an art form, and some people are very, very good at it, but it really is difficult. But I think hopefully, and before we come on to the last question, people can see, listening to this, the complexity of the issue of handling vulnerable customers is so deep that the idea that you could do it once, tick box, that's done, just doesn't resonate. It doesn't sound right. But I do think as well, by working with experts and professionals, you can help simplify it for your staff and help them understand it, because I absolutely agree with you as well. The desire to understand it and do better is absolutely there with people. Then being able to have the right tools for them to do it, actually, it's complex, but it can be handled. And I think, if most business leaders, if they step back and look at their business as a whole, it's complex, but they're handling it. This is just about bringing in the right people to support your people. And obviously that's why, you do what you do. And actually that neatly leads me on to the last thing I was going to ask you, really. Overall, because I think, we see headlines about the general state of CX, but overall, do you see the way that businesses are handling vulnerable customers getting better? Is it staying the same, or is it getting worse?
Oh, it's a tough question. It's changed definitely, and I've been doing this since 2011. So, well, actually, 2014 since we've been training, but I've been working with vulnerability since 2011. So, in 10 years of training, the challenges we face have become different. So in those very early days, even talking about vulnerable customers was something that people and businesses didn't want us to do, because the minute you raise your head above the parapet, you kind of got to recognise that we've acknowledged there's a problem, and then we might have to do something about it. There is now a definite willingness within agents and contact centre leaders to do something and to do better. I think COVID and the pandemic slowed things down a little bit. And because of the cost of living crisis that continues, budgets are being squeezed, and so peak projects are being delayed a little bit, or well, we won't do new starter training every 3 months, we'll do it every 6, for example. But you've got to think about those new people coming into your business and make sure that they reach the same standard as your experienced staff. And I think that some of the challenges are the same. So getting leaders to actually release budget to understand that complexity still exists as a real problem. But those that do get it do spend time at the front line, do spend time listening to calls, do spend time out in branch, mystery shop their own organisations and outside in at your organisation rather than the inside out, because you know the problems that you're facing and the legacy systems, and we can't do that, and you make excuses for your business. Customer doesn't know any of that, so doesn't see that, doesn't understand it, and actually it's not their problem, that's your problem as the business owner. So I think that there is an improved willingness. The other thing that I think substantially changed is regulator environment and the regulator interest in vulnerability. So for years and years, we had the FCA and their treating customers fairly kind of best practice guides, really. Now it's become regulation, and so it's enforceable. And so they've had enough of playing nicely and in trying to encourage businesses to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and now they're making it a part of a requirement, and the other regulators are following. So Ofgem, Ofcom have got an interest in some of this, with the telephone network providers. Fundraising regulator has a treating donors fairly guide. So all sorts of different sectors are looking at it and going, we should be doing better, because we should, and we're not doing it well enough. And so the FCA have taken the step of, look, we've asked you nicely, you've not played nicely, so we're going to make it enforcement. And I think others will follow. There is definitely people signing up to code of practice, but I think at some of the senior levels, that's still a bit of a tick box exercise. And so how do we bring those two parts of the organisation together is probably the challenge that we're facing at the moment, about getting the resources, the skills, the investment to be able to make those changes to deliver better outcomes.
Awesome.
But at least we're talking about it now, which we weren't 10, 15 years ago.
Well, yeah, very true. I think, you know, what I'm taking from your message there is, generally speaking, positive. Although sometimes they're being marched with an arm twisted behind their back, but if that's what it needs, that's what it needs, right? And that's good. And I think, you know, if people are listening to this as well and thinking, okay, well, this has raised some questions for me, or some thoughts. Maybe I need to speak to my senior leadership about getting, you know, some better engagement around this. Presumably, you know, you're happy for people to reach out to you, Elaine, and
Absolutely.
just, you know, pick your brains and try and take some of your time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the my passionate projects is looking after customers in vulnerable circumstances, because we can do better, and we are all customers, and at some point in our lives we will all be vulnerable. So why don't we make it better now, so that when we get to those moments, if you want to take it from a purely selfish perspective, when I get there, I will have a better experience than I would do now. So, you know, or actually we could just be nice people and try and treat everybody better, which is kind of where I sit in this equation. I think in my kind of working career, I have seen businesses grow substantially through value of relationships with customers. So I know it's the right thing to do if you want a big business that's growing. That's great. I've grown businesses from 26 million to 100 million in 3 years just by focusing on customer experience. And if you remember that half of those customers might be in a vulnerable circumstance, there's a really good business case to make those experiences better. And every customer is unique. Every customer has requirements that are unique to them, and we're in a world of personalization now, so we can do better. And for me, I'm happy to work with clients who really want to get on with it, because that makes me happy.
What a place to leave it on. I love it. So there you go. If you want to grow your business by nearly 75 million in 3 years, Elaine's the lady to talk to. It comes down to customer experience. I'll say, if anyone heard any weird banging in the background, I explained this to Elaine in advance. There's building work going on outside my house, literally the other side of a wall. So it's not like, you know, no one's dumping bodies or anything down the end of my office. That's what that hammering noise was. But Elaine, again, really appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us on the CCCX update.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.